They say she killed her own children with her bare hands. They say her laughter could sour milk in the udder and turn newborns blue in their sleep. They say if her shadow touched your doorstep, your family would not see the next harvest. For 11 years, the people of Umoji spat when they said her name. And when the sickness came, the sickness that would empty their village in 7 days, every single one of them ran. Everyone except her. Before you find out what she did and why she let them call her a witch for over a decade without ever once defending herself, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is going to sit with you long after this video ends. Now let's go back to where it started. The village of Umoji sat between two rivers, in the kind of valley that farmers dream about. Soil so rich the yams grew fat with almost no coaxing, palm trees that dripped wine like the earth itself was generous. From a distance, it looked like the safest place in the world. But safety is a story people tell themselves. And in Umoji, that story had a crack running straight through the middle of it. And her name was Adaeze. Adaeze had not always lived alone at the forest edge. Once she had a compound full of noise, a husband named Obioma who carved the finest stools in 3 villages, and 2 children, a boy and a girl, whose laughter used to spill over the fence and into the market square. She had been, by every account, an ordinary woman, not powerful, not strange, just a wife who mixed her own herbal pastes for fevers because her mother had taught her which leaves to boil and which to avoid, the way most mothers in Umoji did. Then came the year the wells turned bitter. It started with the goats. They stopped eating, stood in the sun with their heads low, and within 3 days they were dead, mouths foaming. Then it moved to the children. Fever first, then a stiffness in the neck, then silence. The terrible kind of silence a compound falls into when a mother stops singing because there is nothing left to sing about. Adaeze's children were among the first to fall ill, and because she was the one who understood herbs, she was the one who tried everything. Bitter leaf, uzisa root, boiled bark scraped from the iroko tree behind her hut. She stayed awake for 4 nights straight, pressing wet cloth to her son's burning forehead, forcing spoonfuls of broth past her daughter's cracked lips. Her husband knelt beside her the whole time, praying to gods and ancestors and anyone who might be listening. Neither child survived, nor did Obioma, who fell sick himself, trying to fetch water from a well the whole village would later learn was never touched by any curse, but by something far more human. Grief does strange things to a village. It needs somewhere to go, some shape to take, because raw grief with nowhere to land will tear a community apart from the inside. And so, in the confusion and the fear, someone remembered that Adaeze mixed her own medicines. Someone remembered that she was the one kneeling over her dying children with strange leaves in her hands. Someone whispered the word that would follow her for the next 11 years. Witch. It did not matter that 6 other children in Umoji died that same season, children she never went near. It did not matter that the elder healer, Namadi, confirmed the leaves she used were the same ones mothers had used for 2 generations. Fear does not listen to facts. Fear listens to whoever speaks the loudest, and the loudest voice in Umoji that year belonged to a man named Okonji. Okonji was the chief's younger brother, smooth-tongued, always smiling, always first to offer comfort to a grieving family, and first to suggest gently, almost sadly, that perhaps there was something unnatural at play. He was the one who first said her name alongside the word witch in the marketplace, loud enough for 3 other women to hear. By nightfall, the whole village had heard it. By the next morning, it was truth. She was cast out before the moon changed, not with fire, not with violence. Umoji was not that kind of village, not on the surface, but with something colder. Doors that no longer opened, eyes that slid away from hers in the market, children pulled by their wrists whenever she passed. She built a hut at the edge of the forest, far enough that her presence wouldn't poison the air of the compound, and there she stayed for 11 years, alone with her grief and a silence she chose never to break. Because here is the first thing you need to understand about Adaeze. She never once tried to defend herself, not to the chief, not to Okonji, not even to her own remaining family. When people asked her why, years later, she would only say, "A woman who has already lost everything has nothing left to prove to people who were looking for a reason to blame her." But we'll come back to that, because that silence, that 11 years of silence, was not weakness. It was something else entirely. And you're about to see exactly what. 11 years passed. The chief who exiled her, old Eze Obiora's father, died, and Obiora took the throne. Okonji, his younger brother, became his chief advisor, the man who whispered in the new chief's ear before any decision was made. Umoji grew, new huts, new babies, new faces who had never even seen the witch of the forest, only heard her name used to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or Adaeze will come for you in the night. That's what she had become, a story mothers told, a shadow with no substance. Until the sickness came back. It arrived the way it always does, quietly, in the body of someone nobody suspected. A trader named Ifeanyi returned from a journey to the coast, feverish and shivering, laughing to himself with words that made no sense. Within 2 days, his wife had the same fever. Within 4, his neighbors. By the end of the first week, 17 people in Umoji were burning with a sickness that turned their skin ash gray and left their eyes rolled halfway back in their heads. The village healer, Namdi, his son Chidozi, who had inherited his father's knowledge, tried everything he knew. Nothing worked. Whatever this was, it did not respond to the usual roots and barks. And here is where the tension in Umoji began to crack wide open. Because 2 people in that village recognized the pattern of this sickness immediately. One of them was Adaeze, watching from the tree line, her chest tightening with a memory she had spent 11 years trying to bury. The other was Okonji, and his reaction, if anyone had been paying attention, was not fear. It was something closer to panic mixed with calculation. But nobody was paying attention to Okonji. Everybody was too busy running. Because that is exactly what Umoji did. Within 10 days of the first case, half of the village had already fled to relatives in neighboring towns, terrified the sickness would take them next. Chief Obiora, weak and frightened himself, considered ordering a full evacuation, abandoning the compound their grandfathers built, leaving the sick behind to die alone because there was no cure and no time. Families packed what they could carry. Mothers wrapped healthy children in cloth and walked through the night toward safer villages. The market emptied, the paths out of Umuoji filled with the sound of feet, and the path staying behind filled with the sound of coughing. And in the middle of all that chaos, a group of children playing too close to the forest edge stumbled onto something that would change everything. They found Adaeze boiling a strange black root over a fire outside her hut, her face calm in a way that startled them more than any spell could have. One of the children, brave or foolish or both, asked her the question that had been sitting unspoken in that village for 11 years. "Are you really a witch?" And Adaeze, without looking up from her fire, answered, "Go home and tell your mother that the sickness taking your village is the same one that took my family. Tell her I know the cure. Tell her I have known it 11 years. The child ran. Word spread through the thinning village faster than the fever itself. And here is where you need to lean in. Because what happened next was not the grateful welcome you might expect. It was the opposite. Chief Obiora, desperate but proud, refused to send for her directly. Okonji, standing at his brother's side, made sure of that. "Do you not remember what she is?" Okonji said, his voice smooth as always, dripping with concern that sounded almost real. You would let that woman near your sick children, near you, my brother, the chief? If word spreads that Umuoji called on a witch to save it, we will be a laughingstock from here to the coast. Worse, what if she finishes what she started? What if this is her revenge dressed up as a cure? It was a clever thing to say because it planted fear exactly where fear already lived. And it worked. The chief hesitated. The villagers who remained hesitated. Nobody sent for Adaeze. But she came anyway. She walked into the compound at dusk, carrying a woven basket of roots and leaves, and the entire village, the ones too sick to flee and the ones too afraid to leave their dying relatives, stared at her the way you'd stare at a ghost stepping out of a story. Some backed away. A few mothers pulled their feverish children closer, as if her presence alone might make things worse. An old man spat on the ground when she passed, an old gesture of protection against evil. Adaeze did not flinch. She walked straight to the first hut with a sick child inside, knelt down and began grinding the black root into paste with water from her own gourd. This is the moment this story could have ended in tragedy, because Okonji, watching from the chief's compound with his arms folded and his jaw tight, made a decision in that instant that revealed exactly who he was, though nobody would understand the full weight of it until much later. He sent 2 young men to stop her. Under the pretense of protecting the chief's household, he ordered them to remove her from the village before she could touch a single patient, claiming that if the sickness worsened after her arrival, it would prove, finally, publicly, that she truly was cursed, and Umoji would have every right to drive her out for good, this time with force. The 2 young men found her kneeling beside a child no older than 6, applying the paste to the boy's chest while his mother wept beside him. They grabbed her by the arms and pulled her up, ready to drag her out of the compound. And that is when the mother did something nobody expected. She threw herself between Adaeze and the men. If she leaves and my son dies tonight, I will make sure every person in this village knows whose order sent the only help we had away, whose order that was. The 2 young men hesitated. Word of that standoff spread through the sick and dying compound like fire through dry grass. And here is where the tension breaks open into something bigger than one village and one sickness. Because the mother's outburst forced a question into the open that Okonji had spent 11 years making sure nobody asked. If Adaeze truly caused the first sickness 11 years, why did she know exactly how to cure this one? That question sat in the air of Umoji like smoke that would not clear. And before we get to the answer, because the answer is not what you think, let's pause for a second. If you are finding this story as gripping as I think you are, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button, because the next part of what happened in Umoji is the part almost nobody who tells this story gets right. Most people stop at "the witch saved the village" and think that's the whole story. It is not even close. Stay with me. The chief, hearing of the standoff, finally overruled his brother and allowed Adaeze to move through the village freely. Desperation does that. It makes even proud men swallow their fear. Over the next 3 days, Adaeze moved from hut to hut, treating patient after patient with the same black root paste, along with a bitter tea she brewed from bark she gathered deep in the forest, in a grove most villagers were too afraid to enter. The fevers broke. One by one, the sick who had been given up for dead sat up, asked for food, recognized their families again. Word of it spread through the village even faster than the sickness had. By the 4th day, families who had fled began trickling back, drawn by rumors that a miracle was happening in Umoji, that the witch of the forest was somehow saving the very people who had cast her out. But Adaeze was not resting easy, even as the village began to heal around her, because something had been bothering her since the very first hut she entered. Something in the pattern of the sickness itself, the way it started, the way it spread first through the well nearest the chief's compound before reaching anywhere else. It was too similar, too exact a copy of what had happened 11 years earlier, right down to the goats dying first. Sicknesses do not usually repeat themselves with that kind of precision. Poisonings do. On the fifth night, while most of the village slept the deep, relieved sleep of people who believed the worst was over, Adaeze did something she had not done in 11 years. She walked back into the heart of Umoji, past the huts, past the chief's compound, straight to the well that fed the northern half of the village, the well nearest Okonji's own home. She knelt at its edge and examined the stones around the rim by moonlight, running her fingers along a residue crusted near the waterline, the same pale film she remembered scraping off her own family's well 11 years before, right before everyone she loved began to die. Back then, she had assumed it was some natural blight in the water. She had been young, grieving, and too consumed by loss to question it further. But now, with 11 more years of quiet study behind her, because that is what she had actually been doing in that forest all those years, not casting spells, but learning every plant, root, and poison the land could produce, she recognized the residue immediately. It was not natural. It was Iroko sap mixed with crushed calabar bean, a combination that, in small doses, caused exactly the fever and stiffness that had been terrorizing Umoji for 2 sicknesses now, 11 years apart. It did not grow near this well by accident. Someone put it there. Twice. Adaeze sat back on her heels in the dark, and for the first time in 11 years, she understood, truly understood, that she had not lost her family to a curse, or bad luck, or the will of angry spirits. She had lost them to a person who was still walking free in Umoji, still respected, still trusted, still standing close enough to the throne to do it again. And she realized with a cold certainty settling into her chest that whoever did this had done it again, deliberately this time, using the exact same poison in the exact same place, because they knew that if the sickness returned in a form Adaeze recognized, and if she came forward to explain how she knew the cure, the village would ask the very question that had just been asked in that hut 5 days ago. Whoever did this had gambled that either the village would collapse before she figured it out, or that if she did figure it out, nobody would believe a woman they had called a witch for 11 years over a man who had spent that same decade building trust. It was, in its own devastating way, a perfect plan. Poison the well, let the witch either save the village and be dismissed as suspicious, or fail to save it and be blamed entirely again. Either way, the poisoner walked free, protected by the very story he had built around her. Adaeze did not sleep that night. She sat at the edge of that well until the sky began to lighten, turning over 11 years of grief in her mind, and one name kept surfacing again and again, no matter how many times she tried to push it away, because accusing him meant reopening every wound she had spent a decade trying to seal shut. Okonji. The next morning, she did not go to the chief. She knew, after everything, that her word alone would mean nothing against his brothers. Instead, she did something far more careful. She asked the mother of the boy she had saved, the same woman who stood between her and the 2 young men, to gather 3 other families whose children had survived the sickness, families who now owed her their children's lives and had no reason left to distrust her. She told them what she found at the well. She told them about the residue, about the poison, about the 11-year pattern that matched exactly, and she asked them one simple thing: to check quietly without alerting anyone whether any of their own family wells near Okonji's compound bore the same pale film. 2 did. By midday, 4 families stood with Adaeze in front of the chief's compound, not with accusations shouted in anger, but with evidence laid out calmly. Families who had every reason to want the truth after nearly losing their children twice to the same unexplained horror. Chief Obiora, standing in his doorway, looked at his brother for the first time, not with trust, but with the beginning of doubt. Umoji, to his credit, if you can call it that, did not panic outwardly. He laughed, called it nonsense, said the witch was simply trying to secure her place back in the village by inventing a story wild enough to distract from her own dark history. He turned to the crowd that had gathered, appealing to the same fear that had protected him for 11 years. "Are you really going to believe her," he said, "over me? A woman who vanished into the forest for 11 years, who reappears the moment sickness strikes, who somehow knows the cure before anyone else? Does that not sound to any of you exactly like something a witch would arrange?" It was in a heartbeat, a dangerous moment, the crowd murmured, uncertain, old fears rising back to the surface, the way old fears always do when someone skilled enough knows exactly which words to use. For a heartbeat, it looked like 11 years of careful cruelty was about to walk one more time. But then, the boy's mother stepped forward again, the same woman whose son Adaeze had saved 5 nights earlier, and she said something that changed the direction of everything. "My son was dying," she said, loud enough for the whole compound to hear. "Not from a curse, from a fever, with a cause that this woman understood better than any of us. A witch curses, she does not cure. And you, Umoji," she turned to face him directly, something almost no one in that village had ever dared to do. "You have spent 11 years making sure nobody looked too closely at anything. I want to know why." The question hung in the air, and this time, nobody rushed to fill the silence with fear on Umoji's behalf. Chief Obiora, watching his brother's face, watching for the first time the flicker of something desperate cross it, asked the question that finally cracked the whole thing open. "Brother," he said quietly, "why is there residue at your well too?" There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a crowd right before the truth arrives. You can almost feel it pressing against your chest, and that silence held over Umuoji for what felt like an eternity before Umoji finally spoke, his voice stripped of its usual smoothness. The truth, when it came, was uglier than anyone expected. 11 years earlier, Umoji was not the second son content to stand beside his brother's throne forever. He wanted more. He had watched Obioma, Adaeze's husband, rise in influence among the village elders because of his skill, his fairness, the way people naturally trusted him. Trust that Umoji, for all his charm, could never quite earn honestly. Obioma had been in line to be named head of the Council of Elders, a position of real power that would have made him, in practice, if not in name, more influential in village matters than Umoji himself. So Umoji poisoned the well nearest Obioma's compound, intending, he claimed, his voice cracking as he said it, only to make Obioma sick enough to withdraw his name from consideration, not to kill anyone. But poison does not measure its damage carefully. It took the children first, then Obioma himself. And by the time Umoji understood what he had actually done, it was far easier, far safer to let grief and fear point everyone's fingers at the grieving woman instead. He built the rumor of witchcraft himself, brick by brick, because a dead man's ambitious rival staying silent looks far less suspicious than a grieving woman being cast out for something she never did. And this time, 11 years later, with old age making him desperate to secure his position before Obioma's council rivals, men who had never forgotten Obioma's promise could gain influence over the chief in his final years, Umoji had done it again, poisoned the same well, hoping the chaos would either eliminate threats to his influence or at the very least remind the village exactly who to fear and who to trust. He had not counted on Adaeze recognizing the poison. He had not counted on 11 years of grief turning into 11 years of quiet, careful knowledge. And he certainly had not counted on 4 families standing beside her instead of against her. The compound erupted the moment his confession finished leaving his mouth. Cries of grief for the children lost 11 years ago. Cries of fury from families who had nearly lost their own children this second time. And beneath it all, a silence from Adaeze herself, standing perfectly still, the way she had stood still for 11 years, except now everyone in that crowd finally understood why. Chief Obiora did not hesitate long. His own brother had poisoned his people twice, had let an innocent woman carry the weight of it for a decade while sitting at his side offering counsel built on that very lie. Okonji was stripped of his position immediately and banished from Umuoji before the sun set that day, sent away with nothing but the clothes on his back, forbidding from ever returning. Before you find out what happened to Adaeze after that, because the ending here is not what most people expect, let me remind you, this is exactly the kind of story worth having in your feed. So, if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because there is one more twist left, and it is the part of this story that actually makes it worth telling. You would think after the truth came out that Umoji rushed to make it right, that the chief begged forgiveness, that the village threw a grand celebration in Adaeze's honor, that she was carried back into the heart of the community on the shoulders of grateful families. That is how these stories usually end, isn't it? But real forgiveness, real healing, does not move that fast, and this story would not be worth telling if it pretended otherwise. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways, far more powerful. Chief Obiora offered Adaeze a place of honor in the village, a new compound, servants, a formal apology spoken in front of the whole community. Adaeze listened to every word of it standing at the edge of the crowd, in the same spot she had always stood, neither inside the village nor fully outside it. And then she said something that silenced the whole gathering. 11 years ago, she said, this village decided who I was without asking me a single question. You built a story about me because a story was easier than grief, easier than doubt, easier than looking too closely at a man you trusted. I do not say this with anger anymore. I have carried anger long enough to know it does not feed anyone. But I will not pretend that a place of honor today erases 11 years of doors closing in my face, children pulled away from my shadow, an entire life lived alone at the edge of a forest because it was easier to fear me than to question yourselves. She paused, letting that settle over the crowd like only truth spoken without bitterness can. What I will accept is this: I will stay. Not in a compound built for me out of guilt, but in my hut at the forest's edge, because that forest taught me everything I used to save your children, and I owe it more loyalty than I owe a village that only remembered my worth once it needed something from me. But I will teach. Any mother, any child, any healer who wants to learn what these roots and barks can truly do, not spells, not curses, but medicine, my door will be open. That is the only apology I need from Umoji. Let no other family ever again decide someone is a monster simply because grief needed somewhere to land. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Over the following months, something quietly remarkable happened in Umoji. The children who once ran from Adaeze's shadow began walking to her hut with their mothers, learning to identify which leaves broke a fever and which berries were poison in disguise. The boy she had saved first, the one whose mother had stood between her and two grown men with nothing but her own body, grew up wanting to be a healer himself, and by the time he was a young man, people spoke of him as Namdi's grandson had once been spoken of, with respect, not fear. Adaeze never fully rejoined the heart of the village. She kept her hut at the forest's edge until the day she died, many years later, old and at peace, surrounded by students rather than family, having built in the end a different kind of family entirely. one made of every child she taught to heal instead of fear. And Umoji never forgot the lesson her 11 years of silence eventually taught them, though it took a second tragedy and a village nearly emptied by fear to learn it. The lesson was simple, and it is the same lesson this story has been carrying the whole time, quietly, underneath everything else. The people who run from what frightens them are rarely the ones who save anything. It is almost always the ones everyone else has already given up on, already judged, already decided they understand completely. It is almost always those people who turn out to be exactly what everyone needed, if only someone had been brave enough to ask a real question instead of repeating an easy story. Adaeze was never a witch. She was a woman who loved too deeply, lost too much, and chose in the end to save the very people who had spent 11 years choosing to fear her instead of understanding her. And maybe that is the real reason this story has survived so long, passed from one voice to the next, all the way to right now, to you listening to it end. Because somewhere in your own life, there might be an Adaeze, someone the crowd has already decided about, someone whose silence has been mistaken for guilt. And the next time fear tells you a story about a person, it might be worth asking, quietly, the way those 4 families finally did. Is this the truth? Or is this simply the version that was easiest to believe? If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories about the people history almost forgot, the ones who stayed when everyone else ran. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were standing in that crowd outside the chief's compound, watching Okonji point his finger at the one woman who was right all along. And until the next story finds you, remember, the ones we call monsters are sometimes only the ones we never bothered to understand.